On July 3, 1969, just 13 days before Apollo 11 would land on the moon, one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in human history erupted on a launch pad in Kazakhstan. A Soviet rocket called the N-1, taller than a football field and powered by 30 engines, exploded 5 seconds after liftoff in a massive blast. The fireball mushroomed into the night sky, visible for 40 kilometers. A 40-ton crane was hurled over 1,000 meters like a child's toy. The launch pad, years of infrastructure and millions of rubles, simply ceased to exist. The Soviet state denied it ever happened. While America openly broadcast its moon ambitions with the Saturn V, the Soviet Union was building something even more audacious in complete secrecy. The N-1 rocket was the USSR's answer to Apollo, and it would become the most spectacular failure the world wasn't allowed to know about. This is the story of brilliant engineers forced to skip critical testing, a decades-long cover-up, and the true cost of the space race when national pride eclipses safety. Because when you cluster 30 rocket engines together without ever testing them as a complete system, you're not building a moon rocket. You're building the world's most expensive bomb. Standing 105 meters tall with a base diameter of 17 meters, the N-1 was a monster. Picture this. If you stood at its base and looked up, the rocket would tower over you like a 35-story building. Its total liftoff mass reached 2,735 metric tons, roughly the weight of 550 adult elephants, all balanced on a platform the size of a tennis court. This wasn't just a rocket, it was Sergei Korolev's ultimate vision, the man who had given the Soviets their greatest Cold War victories with Sputnik and Gagarin. For Korolev, the N-1 would cement Soviet technological superiority once and for all. But after Kennedy's 1961 moon challenge, Khrushchev demanded the Soviet Union reach the moon first, and provided no additional funding. Korolev had to build a Saturn V competitor on a shoestring budget, a mandate that would haunt every decision that followed. But here's where ambition collided with brutal physics. While the Saturn V's first stage relied on just 5 massive F1 engines working in harmony, the N-1's first stage featured 30 NK-15 engines, the most complex propulsion system ever attempted. Why 30? Because Soviet rocket engines were less powerful than American ones, and Korolev needed to compensate somehow. 30 engines meant 30 potential points of failure, creating unprecedented vibration and control challenges that Soviet engineers had never encountered before. Imagine trying to balance on a unicycle. Now imagine balancing on a unicycle while juggling. Now imagine doing that while 30 chainsaws are running inches from your body, and if even one chainsaw blade touches another, everything explodes. That was the N-1's first stage, a mechanical nightmare where the failure of a single component could cascade through the entire system in milliseconds. The program was so classified that even its failures remained state secrets. While NASA's setbacks played out on live television, the Soviet Union buried the N-1's disasters in silence. The goal was clear: achieve a crewed lunar landing and restore Soviet prestige after Apollo began surpassing their early space race victories. But that secrecy came with a brutal cost. No one outside the program could learn from their mistakes, and no one inside could admit the scale of the problems they faced. And those problems began with a feud between 2 brilliant men who refused to work together. The N-1's fate was sealed not by bad engineering, but by pride. Sergei Korolev and Valentin Glushko, 2 of the Soviet Union's most brilliant minds, despised each other so much that Glushko refused to build engines for Korolev's moon rocket. The bitter feud stretched back years, rooted in professional jealousy and clashing visions for Soviet spaceflight. Glushko, head of OKB 456 and the Soviet Union's premier rocket engine designer, had the expertise to create the powerful engines the N-1 desperately needed. But he wouldn't lift a finger to help Korolev's lunar dream. Instead, Korolev was forced to turn to Nikolai Kuznetsov's OKB-276, an aircraft engine bureau with zero experience building rocket engines. It was like asking a master watchmaker to build a suspension bridge. The result was the NK-15, each producing 1,500 kilonewtons of thrust. On paper, they looked adequate. In reality, they were oxygen-rich staged combustion engines, cutting-edge technology, but untested at this scale and prone to catastrophic failure if even one malfunctioned. And because no single engine could provide enough power, Korolev's team had to cluster 30 of them in the first stage alone, arranged in a circular pattern like a mechanical flower of death. 30 engines meant 30 potential failure points, all firing in unison just meters apart. The vibration was nightmarish. Acoustic feedback rattled through the structure like a tuning fork from hell. The control system struggled to compensate for the chaos. Engineers warned about these problems. They pleaded for time to test, to iterate, to understand what they were building. But political pressure to beat Apollo drowned out their concerns. Testing was deemed too expensive, too time-consuming. The Americans were racing ahead, and the Soviet Union couldn't afford to look weak. Then came the decision that would doom the entire program. No full-scale static test of the assembled first stage would ever be conducted. Building a test stand capable of containing 4,500 metric tons of thrust, enough force to lift the Eiffel Tower, would cost as much as the rocket itself and take years to build. Years they didn't have. So they decided to test the most complex rocket engine cluster in history by launching it and hoping it worked. It was engineering Russian roulette with a fully loaded chamber. Then, in January 1966, Korolev died unexpectedly during what should have been routine surgery. He was only 59. His successor, Vasily Mishin, inherited a rocket built on compromise and personal vendetta, a machine that had never undergone proper testing, facing an American Apollo program that was accelerating toward the moon with every passing month. Mishin was a brilliant mathematician, but lacked Korolev's political clout and charisma. He would need both. Because now, with untested engines, political pressure mounting, and the Americans racing ahead, Soviet engineers faced an impossible choice: test properly and lose the race, or launch and pray. They chose to launch. Between February 1969 and July 1969, the N-1 went from hope to horror in 2 launches that would define the program's legacy. The first attempt, N-1-3L, lifted off on February 21, 1969. For 68 seconds, it seemed like the impossible might work. The rocket climbed skyward, 30 engines roaring in unison, a pillar of fire ascending into the Kazakhstan sky. Engineers in the bunker held their breath. Then, at T plus 68 seconds, a loose bolt, a single piece of metal no bigger than your thumb, was sucked into a fuel pump. The engine exploded. The cord automatic control system, designed to shut down failed engines and compensate with the remaining ones, tried to respond. But it couldn't handle the cascading failures. One engine failure triggered another, then another, like dominoes falling in a circle. The vibrations amplified. The rocket began to tumble. At 52 kilometers downrange, the N-1 crashed and exploded in a massive fireball visible from the cosmodrome. The world never knew. Soviet secrecy was absolute. But nothing compared to what happened 4 months later, July 3, 1969. Just 17 days before Neil Armstrong would step onto the moon, N-15L sat on its launch pad, fully fueled with 2,400 tons of liquid oxygen and kerosene. The countdown reached 0. Ignition. For half a second, 30 engines roared to life. Then engine number 8 ingested debris from the fuel line. It exploded instantly. The cord system, faced with catastrophic failure at T plus 0.5 seconds, made a fatal decision. It shut down all engines simultaneously. The fully fueled rocket, taller than a 35-story building and weighing as much as a naval destroyer, hung in the air for a moment. Then it fell back onto the launch pad. What happened next was one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in human history. 2,400 tons of propellant detonated with the force of 7 kilotons of TNT, roughly half the yield of the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The blast wave flattened everything within a kilometer. The launch complex, years of construction, millions of rubles, the culmination of thousands of engineers' work, simply ceased to exist. A crater 60 meters wide opened in the earth. That 40-ton crane was found over a kilometer away, twisted like paper. Boris Chertok, a senior engineer, watched from a nearby bunker as the fireball consumed everything. The shockwave hit the bunker like a physical blow. The walls shook, dust rained from the ceiling. Through the reinforced observation window, he saw the mushroom cloud rising into the night sky, illuminated from within by the burning propellant. He later described it as a blow not only to the rocket, but to the spirit of the team. Engineers who had spent years building the N1 watched their life's work vanish in seconds. Some wept. Others sat in stunned silence. Vasily Mishin, already suffering from chronic insomnia after the first failure, reportedly didn't sleep for 3 days. Incredibly, no one was killed. Most personnel had evacuated to bunkers before launch, but the psychological damage was immeasurable. Apollo 11 landed on the moon just 17 days after this catastrophe. But the Soviet Union couldn't admit defeat. Not yet. Mishin and his team would try 2 more times, each failure more desperate than the last. The third attempt came on June 27, 1971, N1-6. Represented 2 years of desperate modifications and improvements. Engineers had worked around the clock, improvising solutions to problems that proper testing would have revealed years earlier. They knew the program was likely doomed, but they couldn't abandon their life's work. This time, the rocket actually flew. For 51 seconds, it climbed skyward, reaching 7 kilometers altitude. For 51 seconds, it seemed like redemption might be possible. Then the engine vibrations, those same harmonics that engineers had warned about, caused the vehicle to roll uncontrollably. The automatic destruct system activated, and the rocket exploded 7 kilometers above the steppe. It was a small victory wrapped in failure. The rocket had flown, proving the basic design could work. But it also revealed that engine clustering created vibration harmonics that the core system couldn't compensate for. The problem wasn't just individual engine reliability, it was the fundamental physics of putting 30 rocket engines in close proximity. Imagine 30 opera singers standing in a circle, each singing a different note. Individually, they're perfect. But together, they create acoustic interference patterns. Some notes amplify, others cancel out, and the overall sound becomes chaotic. That was the N1's engine cluster, except instead of sound waves, it was structural vibrations that could tear metal apart. November 23, 1972. N1-7L, the fourth and final attempt. By now, America had conducted 6 successful moon landings. The political will to continue was evaporating like water on the lunar surface. But the engineers pressed on. At T plus 107 seconds, the rocket reached 7 kilometers altitude. Then a fuel line ruptured due to vibration-induced metal fatigue. The metal had literally been shaken apart by the engine cluster's harmonics. The rocket exploded. Vasily Mishin watched another fireball bloom in the sky. He had spent years of his life on this program, sacrificing his health, his sleep, his sanity. And for what? 4 explosions, 0 successes. The Americans had already won. The tragic irony was that the final 2 launches showed the N1 design was improving. With continued development, with the testing time and resources that had been denied from the beginning, it might have eventually succeeded. The NK-15 engines, for all their problems, were actually brilliant pieces of engineering. The keyword system was learning from each failure. The structural improvements were working, but political patience had run out. The engineers' years of work would be destroyed, not by technical impossibility, but by the same political pressure that had rushed them to failure in the first place. By 1974, with Apollo's success and the N-1's repeated failures, the decision was made to cancel the N-1 and effectively erase it from history. The order came from Valentin Glushko, the same man whose feud with Korolev had started this disaster. Glushko was now in charge after Mishin's dismissal, and his first act was to kill his rival's dream. All hardware was ordered destroyed. Documentation was classified. The program was erased from official history. For nearly 2 decades, the N-1 would exist only as a rumor, a ghost story whispered among Western intelligence analysts. Then, in the 1990s, as the Soviet Union collapsed and Glasnost opened the archives, the truth emerged, and with it, a surprising revelation about the rocket's legacy. After the program's cancellation in 1974, the Soviet state moved swiftly to erase all evidence. Remaining 105 rockets were meticulously scrapped, 105-meter giants cut apart and buried in the Kazakhstani steppe. Launch facilities at Baikonur were dismantled, the blast craters filled in. Documents were classified at the highest levels. Engineers were forbidden from discussing their work. For nearly 20 years, the USSR denied the N-1 had ever existed, shifting focus instead to space stations and automated missions while the West celebrated Apollo's triumph. The secrecy worked. It contributed to the perception of total American dominance in space, obscuring the genuine technical achievements buried in the N-1's wreckage. But it also caused lasting damage to Soviet engineering. By classifying all N-1 documentation, the Soviet Union prevented its own engineers from learning from these failures, hampering future programs. The lessons were buried with the hardware. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Those supposedly unreliable Kuznetsov NK-15 engines, the ones that clustered and failed so spectacularly, were later resurrected. In the 1990s, American company Aerojet purchased NK-33 engines, upgraded NK-15S, that had been hidden away in a warehouse for decades. These engines proved remarkably advanced and were used in America's orbital ATK Antares launcher. However, design modifications were necessary to ensure safe integration within the Antares rocket. The engines weren't the problem. The integration was. The lack of testing was. The political pressure was. The core lesson of the N-1 is brutally simple. Rocket engineering cannot be rushed. The Saturn V succeeded partly because it underwent extensive ground testing. Every stage was fired repeatedly while bolted to the ground, allowing engineers to measure every vibration, every pressure fluctuation, every potential failure mode before the first launch. The N-1 never had that luxury. Soviet engineers tested individual NK-15 engines, but never the assembled cluster of 30. They were forced to conduct their full-scale tests during actual launches, a process that was both financially ruinous and psychologically devastating. And today, if you watch a SpaceX Starship launch, you're witnessing the N-1's vindication. Super Heavy, Starship's first stage, uses 33 Raptor engines, more than the N-1's 30, directly echoing that ambitious clustering approach. But this time, it works. Why? Modern computer control manages what 1960s Soviet technology couldn't, where the N-1's keyword system was essentially flying blind, making crude adjustments based on limited sensor data. Starship's computers make thousands of adjustments per second, monitoring every engine parameter in real time. SpaceX has conducted extensive ground testing, static fires where all 33 engines burn while the rocket remains bolted down, exactly the testing the N-1 never received. And SpaceX's iterative philosophy, fail fast, learn faster, represents everything the N1 program was never allowed to do. The unsung engineers and technicians who worked on the N1 finally received recognition in the glasnost era of the late 1980s. Their innovations, particularly those NK-15 engines, proved their work wasn't in vain. But recognition came too late for many. Korolev died before seeing his creation fly. Mishin was dismissed in disgrace. Countless engineers spent their best years on a project they knew was doomed but couldn't abandon. The N1 story serves as a cautionary tale for any program where political deadlines override engineering realities, from space programs to nuclear power to AI development. The most dangerous force in engineering isn't technical complexity. It's the pressure to declare victory before the work is done. We began with an explosion that the Soviet Union tried to erase from history, a catastrophic failure that seemed to prove the impossibility of their lunar ambitions. The fireball on July 3, 1969, consumed more than a launch pad and a rocket. It consumed years of work, billions of rubles, and the dreams of thousands of engineers who believed they could reach the moon. But the true story reveals something more nuanced than simple failure. The N1 didn't fail because clustering 30 engines was impossible. SpaceX proves that today with 33 engines on Starship. The N1 failed because political pressure transformed a solvable engineering challenge into an impossible deadline. The brilliant engineers of OKB-1 weren't defeated by physics. They were defeated by the same political system that demanded they achieve the impossible without the time or resources to do it properly. Sergei Korolev's feud with Valentin Glushko denied the program the engines it needed. Khrushchev's demand for victory without funding denied it the resources. The decision to skip full-scale testing denied it the data. And the wall of secrecy denied future engineers the lessons that failure teaches. Today, we see echoes of their struggle in every ambitious project, where political will clashes with engineering reality. When deadlines are set by press conferences rather than physics. When budgets are determined by politics rather than requirements. When failure must be hidden rather than learned from. The N1's legacy isn't just one of failure. It's a reminder that the most dangerous force in engineering isn't technical complexity, but the pressure to declare victory before the work is done. Those NK-15 engines, the ones that failed so spectacularly, eventually flew successfully on American rockets. The clustering approach, the one that seemed impossible, now powers the world's most advanced launch system. The engineers, the ones who were forced to fail, created innovations that outlived the Soviet Union itself. The N1 never reached the moon, but its shadow stretches across every launch pad where engineers still fight the same battle, the struggle to build tomorrow's miracles with today's resources, under yesterday's deadlines. In the end, the real explosion wasn't the 7 kilotons of TNT on July 3, 1969. It was the detonation of a dream, a reminder that in the unforgiving vacuum of space, ambition without patience doesn't launch rockets. It destroys them. The N1 rockets are gone, scrapped, and buried in the Kazakhstani steppe. But their story refuses to stay buried, because it's a story that every generation of engineers must learn again. The cosmos doesn't care about your deadlines. Physics doesn't negotiate with political pressure. And the only way to reach the stars is to respect the unglamorous, time-consuming work of testing, failing, learning, and trying again. Which engineering challenge from the space race seemed most impossible to overcome? The N1's 30-engine cluster, the Apollo computer with less power than your phone, or the heat shield that had to survive re-entry temperatures hotter than the sun's surface? Let me know in the comments what you think was the most audacious gamble of the space age. And if you want to explore more hidden stories from the Cold War space race, hit that subscribe button, because the cosmos is full of secrets that deserve to be told.